So folks, today in this lesson, we're going to be talking about mountains and mustard seeds. So it's in Matthew 17, verse 20, and it says this: "If you have faith as a grain of a mustard seed, you will tell this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." Now this verse has fascinated scholars and Christians throughout the centuries. What does this mean? Can we literally move a mountain, or is this a metaphor for something that's seemingly impossible? The mountains that are in our life that would seem impossible to move. And then what's up with the mustard seed? Why is a mustard seed used in particular? And then one question we always have is this the same mustard seed that Jesus is referring to in the parable of the mustard seed? So we'll cover this today, and we're going to explore really the cultural background to this saying itself, mustard seeds and mountains. This would be a common expression in Jesus' day, an idiomatic phrase to express something that's going on. And we're also going to talk about this word faith. How do we understand that word faith? Because later, which is today, modern Christians, particularly in the West, we have a conception of what that word faith means, how we use it, and it's radically different than it would be used in the first century. So we're going to look at all three of these things, and we're going to talk about what exactly does Jesus mean. Now, we do have a lesson that is just on the parable of the mustard seed. So if you want some more detail on the mustard seed and the significance of that particular parable, check out that lesson. I'm not going to be able to go into as much detail today. This is a much shorter lesson, but I will hit all the details very briefly. And what happens, the way that we approach the text, and this is the point when we should be asking ourselves, what would this have meant in the original context? Original context is first century, Jewish faith, land of Israel, Hebraic way of thinking. That's the context before attempting to determine what it means. And there is a lot of confusion over this parable because there's more than one plant that grows in Israel that's a mustard plant. We'll talk about that today. But also because we read parables very much with a Greek mindset rather than a Hebraic or Eastern mindset. The Greek mind wants to make everything logical and consistent and orderly and for everything to line up perfectly. And we do that as if the parable itself, the details that Jesus includes, that Jesus would only include them if they're all consistent and line up and logical, and perhaps even sometimes we read parables as a literal story. But parables they're not literal, they're made up. Jesus controls the details. Now, these parables, no doubt, they carry a truth. It's just like a fable. Every kid knows the tortoise and the hare. Well, clearly that's not a true story, literal story, but it carries a truth that is always there and we can understand. That's what the story does. That's what a parable does. And Jesus, in almost every parable, he's adding a twist, something unexpected. Something that jars the audience awake, their mind. Oh, wait a minute. Now I have to think about what he's saying. And of course, that audience, his first century audience that he's speaking to, Jewish faith, Hebraic way of thinking, land of Israel. So his references are being pulled right out of the land, the culture, and the context that they live in, not ours. And that creates all kinds of problems. And this is the problem with our Greek way of thinking, trying to solve an Eastern Hebraic parable, is what we end up with is that confusion reigns. So if you want to check out that parable and get more details about what he's doing and how he's twisting things to get their attention, go look at that lesson. It'll really help with that particular parable and eliminate some of the confusion that has existed over the centuries. Okay, so today's just an agenda for today. We're going to talk about the mustard seed. Why does that matter to our understanding of what Jesus is saying? We're going to talk mountain. What is he talking about? Is this literal mountain or is it figurative? Third, and this is not explicitly in the text, but I think you can see what's going on. There's a principle in the first century, and it's within rabbinic thought, rabbinic ways of interpreting the Bible. And of course, Jesus is a rabbi. That's where he belongs. He's a first century rabbi in Israel. And we find this principle throughout the New Testament. Now, it's most prominently in Jesus' sayings and in Paul, since Paul was trained as a rabbi. But the phrase in our English Bible is how much more. You're making a comparison. How much more? If something that's very small is true, then how much more is the greater or more important thing true? So we'll take a look at that. And then finally, we'll talk about the idea of faith and how this word, how we use it today in the West versus the way it was used in Eastern or Hebraic thought. And really, we could think about faith. That word can be also translated to believe or trust. But it's really an idea, and this is where we're going to go towards the end, expectant trust. I believe, I have faith, I trust the power of God and that God can and will move in the world today. You are expecting that God will act and do things that seem impossible. All right, here we go. Mustard seed. There are at least 2 different plants within the mustard family that grow in Israel. And the first one I'll show you is the one that we generally think of when you hear the word mustard. It's the seed that makes the spice that we turn into a condiment and put on our hot dogs. So here's a picture from near the Sea of Galilee, and this is a field of mustard plant. Okay? Now these are the cultivated mustard plants that are used for the spice. So you can see that flower if you get a close-up picture of both the plant and the seed pods. That's important. Notice the long seed pods that hold those larger mustard seeds, because these mustard seeds are not the smallest seed in the garden. And this is the thing that throws us off the parable, because we want to make the parable about this plant. This is the Brassica nigra, a mustard plant. And you can see right here, this is the larger seed pod, and that holds the larger seeds. And so we want to take that parable and make everything line up perfectly, and it doesn't, because Jesus is mixing and matching, and he's switching, causing his audience to have to think. Anyways, that's not the point right now. The point is right here. This is the larger seed where you get the condiment. But there is another mustard plant that grows in Israel. It's called Brassica elongata. This is also in the mustard family. Now, the thing with this one is that this is a noxious weed. It's an invasive species. It grows anywhere and everywhere. It will take over your garden. It's a weed. So, what about these seeds? What about these seeds for this particular mustard plant? What if we look at that? Well, let me show you a picture. This photo here is of the Brassica elongata, the mustard plant. Now, we had just pulled that off of some rocks. I'll show you a picture in a minute where that came from, but it came off of some rocks, and we were at the ancient city of Bet Shan. Bet Shan was actually a Decapolis city. It's just south of the Sea of Galilee, but it's in Israel. You can see there in that photo the elongated yellow flowers. Okay, now let's take a look at the seeds for that particular plant. Okay, and here they are right here. Oh, wait a minute, let me help you with this right here. Here's a seed. Do you see the little specks? Those are the seeds. They're about the size of a grain of salt. This thing right here, that larger thing, that's the seed pod that carries all of the seeds. So if you take that little seed pod and you gently crush it in your hand, all of the seeds will fall out into the palm of your hand. That's what you see here in this photo. And those little seeds, when they release, that plant will grow and spread everywhere. Okay? In fact, they will even grow among the stones that are used for buildings. They'll grow in rocky soil. They'll grow on the sides of mountains, on cliff sides that are rocky. You wouldn't think a plant could grow there. So that plant is able to find purchase where other plants wouldn't. Okay, so here's where if you look in this yellow circle, okay, on top of those rocks is where we pulled that mustard plant. That's the city of Bet Shan. Now you can see that when you build in Israel, it's always stone, right? It's a whole nother lesson on why we call Jesus a carpenter. The Greek word is tekton, and it just means builder. But our mindset is Western Europe, where you build with wood, and in Israel, though, you build with stone. So Jesus is probably more stonemason than carpenter, but again, that's a whole nother lesson. But we were in this theater at Bet Shan. One of the gentlemen climbed up to the top of those rocks, pulls off a weed, and that's our mustard plant. And so as you walk around, I thought I had some photos from the last time I was there, but I couldn't find them on my disk drive. Anyways, but as you walk around the ruins of Bet Shan, all around those stones, if you know what you're looking for, you'll see these mustard plants, and they're clinging to everything. They're growing out of the stones. There's no discernible soil, but you'll see those weeds sticking out of the rocks. And so when those plants, that mustard seed plant, when they're able to take root, say, in the crack of a stone, and they begin to grow, what can a plant do to that stone? What can end up happening to the stone? The plant can break the stone in half. And so you get a little tiny seed. It looks so insignificant, and yet it can move a mountain, literally. Okay, so let me give you a quote. This is from a scholar. His name is Brad Young. The book is called Jesus, the Jewish Theologian. This is a great book for understanding Rabbinic thought, Eastern thought, the Hebraic mind. I highly recommend it. He says this about the mustard seed. He says, the mustard seed is noted for its ability to take root. Now, previous to this, he talks about the size, it's about a grain of salt, or the size of a grain of salt. So it's noted for its ability to take root in rocky, difficult to cultivate soil. The seed will grow between the stones of a building or on a rocky mountainside. That's exactly true. And the natural growth process of the plant and its roots can literally move huge stones as it grows. That's Brad Young, Jesus, the Jewish Theologian. Now, a couple things. This fascinated the rabbis, the teachers in Israel. And it's a great example of what amazing teachers they are. So they're able to observe something happening in nature that everybody there is aware of, that this tiny little seed that can eventually move a stone, that's what they're observing. And then they use that as an example to know something about God, something about the power of God, something about the kingdom of God. And these teachers are absolutely wonderful at using these very simple yet illustrative examples that everybody can understand because it's in their world all around them. This is exactly what Jesus is doing. In fact, in Jesus' day, the phrase, the size of a mustard seed, it meant something to the rabbis. It meant something very small. So it comes right out of that experience that they're having in daily life. And we in the modern West, first of all, we don't talk this way. Now, maybe we'd find it like in some subcultures, like farmers or something that work very closely to the land and the plants, where they would relate to each other and life through examples from the plants. But for most people here in the West, we're very abstracted from all of that, and that seems just foreign to us, but not in the East. Even today, if you go to the East in these very traditional villages, even as far all the way through China, their tendency is to pull from nature and to be able to use expressions to explain things about life that come right from their local settings. So, we have this amazing little teeny seed. Look at the power that that little teeny seed has. And then what we're going to do is make a comparison. Because who created that little seed? Well, God did. And if God gave that little teeny seed all of that amazing power to move a stone, to break a rock, to kick off a part of a mountain, then how much more will God give you? And this is where we get to this phrase. Now, it's not specifically here in the text. In this one, now you'll find the phrase, how much more, throughout the New Testament. It's not here explicitly, but it's implicit, right? We have to look at what Jesus is doing when he makes this comparison. He's explaining its miraculous power of expectant faith, right? That we can trust in the power of God and trust that that will be manifested into the world. How much more does God care about you? Okay? So in Hebrew, this is called kal vahomer. It's a principle for scripture interpretation. Now, kal vahomer, it translates literally light and heavy. And it means something like, if this little light thing is true, then how much more, when it comes to something more significant or weightier, is it true? That's where you get the how much more. So if we look at this, we have a tiny little mustard seed, seemingly insignificant. And yet, it gets its power from God, from the Creator, and it's able to move a mountain, a stone. Well, if that's true for a tiny little mustard seed, now we add our phrase, how much more if you simply have the smallest aspect of faith, that even the smallest piece of expectant trust or certainty that God is going to act, that the power of God can move through that, and the power of God can move a mountain. So it's the power of God. It's available even to the smallest bits of faith. Okay, so it's not you having faith that moves the mountain. It's your faith in the power of God to move in whatever situation you might be in. Now, that's the how much more. See, it's not written, but you know Jesus is making the comparison between the mustard seed and the faith that moves mountains. Now, quickly, if we get to the end of this and we say, well, what do we mean by faith? What does the Bible mean by faith versus how we use that word today? So, faith, in the modern West, we generally use the word faith as belief, like a verb, to believe something. We do this rather than trust, right? Even though they're related. But today people speak of having faith in God. And what we kind of mean by that is, well, I've had an intellectual assent We have a world view that says God doesn't exist, and I have assented to believe, I have faith that God does exist. But that's type of thinking, that's very modern. It's completely different than faith as it means in that first century setting. Because faith, God was everything to everybody. They were in relationship to God. And this type of faith is not about believing that something exists. It's about your relation to God. Those Jewish people were in a covenant relationship with God. And so faith, in a sense, is practical reliance on God. Do you trust that? That's why trust, I think, is a better word. Do you trust that God can and will act? Do you have certainty? Do you move without doubting? Do you have certainty that God's power is available with even the smallest element of faith or belief or certainty? That you understand that the power of God is available through that smallest amount of, say, expectant trust. It's not about believing more like it's a noun that you can have more of, but it's about being certain that God can and will act even through the smallest amounts of faith. Now, where we get into these problems here is when we think about the outcome, because for many people, when they're praying to God, they have the outcome that they want in mind. So that if the outcome of the situation is different than the one that you're expecting, well, whose problem is that, right? We must accept the resulting outcome, and we must expect that the resulting outcome is the highest possible good from God. We know that God is acting. His actions always produce the highest good in any situation. But if you didn't get what you were specifically praying for, then there must be a reason. There must be a higher good there. If you didn't get the promotion, if you didn't get the new job, if you didn't get that house you wanted, whatever it is, but you're confident that God is always acting on your behalf and that the highest possible good is always what he brings you, then we're more at peace with how our life rolls out. So it's a type of confidence, an expectant trust that God can and will act and is always acting on our behalf, even though I can't see it. So pray for the highest possible outcome, whatever that is, rather than praying for something specific, because that might not be the highest possible outcome. So here's the story. Your faith, it's the littlest belief that the power of God can act through, and he can move things. He can move things in your life that seem like they would be impossible to move. Just like that teeny little speck, you would think, there's no way that thing can move a rock. And God says, oh yeah, watch this. And so then we trust that the power of God can move anything in our lives. That little amount of faith can bring about the power of God, the movement of mountains in our life.